Neoliberalism, roughly from the 1970s to perhaps 2015, or some rough time like that, 30, 40, 45 years, that policy, neoliberalism, often referred to as globalization, was a policy in which the governments of Western Europe and North America and Japan eagerly supported a global free trade, no tariffs, minimum government intervention in the economy, support for corporations that relocated their business out of the country, internationalization. Governments told the people, you will be better off with free trade. Your standard of living will rise. Your job opportunities will improve. This was incorrect. It was bad economics then, but it was a very good rationale for what corporations in the West wanted to do. They wanted to go to China, India, Brazil, and so on to take advantage of the low wages and the growing market. And in order to do that, they had to overcome the nationalism that was still a strong tendency in these countries. So what happened was the neoliberal promise turned out to be half true, half false. The true part is it made huge profits. It was a successful program for increasing the profits of Western corporations. They could pay much lower wages in China and India than they paid where they came from. And they had the growing Chinese market and the growing Asian market. And so they had tremendous profits. That's why you saw a boom in the stock market in the West, because it was the only institution where you could see the profits producing rising wealth. But I like to remind people that in the United States, the richest 10% of our people own 80% of the shares on the stock market. So successful profiteering is only good for the top 10%, not for the masses. Meanwhile, for the masses, it was very bad. Millions of jobs working in manufacturing disappeared in the United States. Whole states out of the 50 states in the United States, whole states basically collapsed economically. Their industries disappeared, their jobs disappeared, their unions lost membership, they were forced to become low-wage service economies that they had not been before. It has been a trauma, a political, ideological trauma. And over those 40 years, I'll give you one example. In 1970, presidents from around the world, if they visited the United States, were taken to the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit was the center of the automobile industry in this country. Ford, General Motors, all of that. And it was a booming city. It had 2 million, which was very big then, 2 million people, a very successful labor union, the United Auto Workers, and all of that. Today, Detroit is a disaster. Its population has dropped from 2 million in 1970 to 700,000 today. That means that more than half the people in that powerful, successful city are gone. It is now a city 1/3 of abandoned housing. No one lives there. No one can afford to live there because there are no jobs. So that's an extreme example. But other large cities in the United States, Cleveland, Wilmington, Delaware, parts of Chicago have similar, Buffalo, New York, have similar histories. And it is, for the mass of people, it has been a very difficult time. And so they are the losers of neoliberalism, but they are also the vast majority. And it was only a matter of time before an opportunistic politician would begin to see opportunity in speaking to the millions of people who had been hurt by neoliberalism because it was a boon for the profiteers, but not for the mass of people. That's our politics today. Mr. Trump simply rides on the wave of hostility to what has happened to the United States.
And it's not like at the time Reagan implemented trickle-down economics in the early 80s that it was this brand new, newfangled invention that everyone was optimistic about. A lot of people were like, hey, this is really gonna hurt poor people. But Ronnie was convinced by his neoliberal economic pals that keeping the wealthiest people happy will mean prosperity for all. Because Ronald Reagan was convinced that the American dream was alive and well. And the common theme through all of his policy choices was that individuals are the creators of their own destiny, that anyone could pick themselves up by their bootstraps if they really wanted to, and that any struggling was simply a moral failure on the part of the individual, and not a failing on the part of the system that stood on their necks. And it was through Reagan that this idea that the government is your enemy and stands in the way of your freedom and prosperity really took hold in the Republican consciousness writ large, to the point that working and middle-class people voted to re-elect him, even though it was actively against their own best interest to do so. Sound familiar?
In 1994, Mexico, the United States, and Canada signed NAFTA, creating a trilateral trade bloc. NAFTA was a trilateral trade agreement signed in 1994 by Mexico, the United States, and Canada. The agreement aimed to promote economic integration and free trade among the three countries. NAFTA eliminated most tariffs and trade barriers, facilitating the flow of goods and services across the borders. While the agreement brought economic benefits to Mexico, such as increased foreign investment and export opportunities, it also generated debates regarding its impact on labor rights, environmental regulations, and the agricultural sector. In 2020, NAFTA was replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which introduced some modifications to the original agreement.
The bargain of the last half century or so was politicians saying to the American public, we're going to let factory work go abroad. Don't worry about that. Be bankers, be software engineers. Let China do the dirty jobs, and we'll get a lot of cheap stuff in the meantime. It was a very naive bargain.
There's been a consensus in this country for decades about how the economy should be run.
It's defined by neoliberalism.
The Washington Consensus.
The neoliberal consensus, let's call it that.
Today you reached a new low, I think, by suggesting that manufacturing in America doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where the product is produced.
Congressman, we have the highest standard of living in the world.
No, we do not.
For years, that system looked unstoppable.
It is the economic equivalent of a force of nature.
Until it wasn't.
Your husband signed NAFTA, which was one of the worst things that ever happened to the manufacturing industry.
That is your opinion.
You go to New England, you go to Ohio.
The consensus of the last 50 years is collapsing. In its place, something new is taking shape. And the man behind it is not who you'd expect.
Let me start off with two words. Made in America.
Wait, pause. Did you catch that?
Made in America.
Contained in those 3 words is actually a radical declaration, a plan to transform the American economy.
So if you look at what Biden has done, it is a major, major sea change in how government has worked in the U.S. in the last 40 years.
Joe Biden's policies are an enormous break with a neoliberal consensus.
But to understand what Biden's plan actually is, you have to dive deep into the ideology that has shaped our economy for the last 50 years. For decades after World War II, unionized manufacturing jobs at companies like GE and GM had built the middle class. By 1970, middle-class households were taking home 62% of all income.
So if you were to look in the 1970s at the fortunes of workers, companies in the country, it would kind of move in tandem. They were linked in some way.
By the 1980s, they started to diverge.
There's a lot of deregulation, a lot of changes to tax policy that allow finance to just take off. And one of the great emblems of this is GE. General Electric was one of the oldest corporations in America. It's one of the original innovators. But by the time the 80s and the 90s roll around, Jack Welch, Neutron Jack Welch as he was called, comes in and starts slashing and burning people.
He got rid of 100,000 GE employees.
You were criticized because you got rid of so many people.
Yep.
And you didn't pull back.
No.
You went forward with it.
Harder.
And this is another part of financialization where human beings, workers, are sort of looked at like widgets. Costs on the balance sheet to be moved off so companies can become more efficient, so that share prices can go up.
Under the new paradigm, maximizing share prices was what mattered, and wealth began to shift, away from workers, innovation, and manufacturing, into financial assets like stocks, loans, and real estate.
You know, in the 80s, global capital was unleashed. Well, by the 90s, global trade started to be unleashed.
I was there at the beginning of the whole free trade thing. I saw some of the job losses coming, but I didn't see as many losses as actually did result.
Robert Reich was the Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton when NAFTA was signed into law. NAFTA eliminated trade barriers between the US, Canada, and Mexico.
The advocates of free trade believed that American consumers would benefit from cheaper goods coming from around the world. I was told and repeatedly assured by the advocates for NAFTA that American jobs would be protected by strict labor standards. The fact of the matter is that as labor secretary, every time I went to Mexico to try to enforce the labor standards, nothing happened.
All told, the US lost around 700,000 jobs from NAFTA. But an even bigger shock was about to hit the system. In 2000, Clinton normalized trade relations with China, supporting the country's entry into the World Trade Organization.
The addition of the Chinese economy to the global marketplace will result in a more efficient worldwide allocation of resources and will raise standards of living in China and its trading partners.
Chinese exports flooded America and really were responsible for a large percentage of the losses of manufacturing jobs in the United States.
And when the jobs disappeared, the shops, the banks, the people disappeared too.
Between 1998 and 2021, the US lost more than 5 million manufacturing jobs due to trade policies.
There's no future here. With 75% of your refrigerators being built in Mexico.
They promised basically jobs for our kids if they wanted them. That's not happening.
There was a real Faustian bargain that was made in the 1990s onward. We outsourced our entire industrial commons in exchange for cheap stuff. We decided to stop making things and start consuming things. One of the beauties, in some ways, of the neoliberal system, at least for those that were buying into it, is that it was simple. As long as share prices were going up and consumer prices were going down, there was no problem. As long as companies were getting richer, things were supposedly fine.
Amidst all of that wealth creation, America's middle class saw its share of national income decline.
That's the sort of dirty little secret of neoliberalism, which is that, yeah, the pie got bigger, but fewer people got a slice of it. All the things that make us middle class, education, healthcare, housing, the price of these things didn't go down. Indeed, the price of these things rose. At the same time you get a lot of cheap consumer goods, you also get a cost of living crisis. So it's a very dangerous paradox.
Please welcome the next president of the United States, Mr. Donald J. Trump.
It took, I think, essentially the 2016 election, where both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump critiqued that mainstream view, for policymakers in Washington to really wake up to the reality of what they had wrought.
They say Trump is starting a trade war. I say no. The trade war ended a long time ago, and the United States lost because our leaders didn't take care of our people and our companies. The era of global freeloading and taking advantage of the United States is over. It's just over.
There was a kind of a coming to Jesus moment under Trump, but the problem with the Trump administration is it didn't have any policy prescription for the US itself. It simply said, China's bad, we're gonna slap tariffs on China.
But at the same time, another more ambitious policy plan was being developed elsewhere. A senior advisor to Hillary Clinton was shaken by the loss in 2016. He traveled to Ohio, Colorado, and Nebraska to talk to Americans from across the political spectrum. The result was a report, Foreign Policy for the Middle Class, co-authored by Jake Sullivan.
My national security advisor, I choose Jake Sullivan, and it helps steer what I call a foreign policy for the middle class.
Biden comes in and says, we need an entirely new philosophy of growth.
It's based on a simple premise that will reward work, not wealth in this country.
He's created what some people would call Bidenomics, what some people would call a post-neoliberal world.
I don't buy for 1 second that the vitality of American manufacturing is a thing of the past.
What this means is that he's decided to prioritize not just share prices and not just consumers, but jobs, incomes, communities.
Today, we're getting to work to rebuild the backbone of America. Manufacturing, unions, the middle class.
Over the past 4 years, the Biden administration has quietly translated that worldview into a multi-trillion-dollar set of policies.
You have to go back to the 50s when the statistics were created to find anything comparable to the level of manufacturing investment that we see right now.
That investment can be broken down into 3 pieces of legislation: the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law,
a massive infrastructure bill,
the Inflation Reduction Act,
helping to fuel a boom in clean energy all across the United States,
and the CHIPS and Science Act,
boosting domestic semiconductor production.
We have not seen an infrastructure program this big since the Eisenhower era. We haven't seen ambition that government could do this much, I would argue, since FDR.
Under Biden, investment in manufacturing construction has surged to more than triple the average rate of the 2010s. And those investments are flowing disproportionately to counties where unemployment is highest.
It could be ultimately trillions of dollars that get invested in the economy, targeted not at what private industry is focused on in recent decades, like stock buybacks and other policies that redistribute income upwards. Instead, we're seeing companies invest in real places with real workers for the first time in generations.
How's it been? How's it impacted your life?
Man, tremendously. My life completely changed, man. I got things now that I never thought I could have.
Now we're in a position to where we have 19, 20-year-old people that are working and are thinking about their future.
It sets you up for the future: medical, dental, vision, pension, something to fall back on when it's all over with.
After decades of stagnating wages, these investments are creating well-paid jobs with good benefits. And that's by design.
There's something called the investment tax credit that's a part of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Think of it like layers in a cake.
What it does is say that the public sector will help businesses cover 6% of their capital cost if they are just investing in a clean energy technology that we find interesting. But you can get 5 times that amount if you're also paying prevailing wages and running apprenticeship programs. You can get an additional 20% of that if you're investing in a low-income community, 10% if you are investing in a community that's been historically reliant on the fossil fuel industry, and an additional 10% on top of that if you are using made-in-America supply chains. If you take all of the layers in the cake, companies could see up to 70% of their capital cost covered.
These types of policies are an attempt to shift companies away from the financial logic that has dominated corporate behavior for decades.
Take an example like Cleveland-Cliffs. This is one of the country's premier steel manufacturers. In recent decades, they've engaged a lot in stock buybacks to reward their shareholders. Now they're working with the United Steelworker Union to build clean steel in places across the country.
But in a global economy built by decades of free trade, what's to stop jobs like these from getting wiped out again?
You're about to get a clear view of China's capacity to build.
This is a really big moment for the global economy.
The US has accused China of a practice called dumping, flooding the market with a surplus of goods, like electric vehicles or solar panels, at artificially low prices.
We've seen this story before, when the global market is flooded by artificially cheap Chinese products. The viability of American firms is put into question.
China has that surplus in part thanks to years of careful planning and massive government subsidies. But weak environmental and labor standards are also a factor.
The worry is that if we are just importing the lowest cost products, that it will undermine labor standards here at home and undermine the US economy.
Biden has kept Trump's China tariffs in place and recently announced new tariffs on Chinese goods.
I thought Trump was right to put tariffs on China. I think Biden was right to continue them. Not for punitive reasons, but because within the current system, China is not playing by the rules of the game.
The Biden administration's tariffs on China are targeted in the same sectors where it's investing at home, like steel, semiconductors, and clean energy. The goal is to protect the jobs created in those sectors from being undercut by cheaper imports.
You simply cannot say, I'm going to outsource the entire clean energy transition to one country and not have any of those jobs in my own country and expect there to be a country left after that. Just like it took 40 years for neoliberalism to play out, it's going to take many years and even decades for the post-neoliberal era to play out. You look at, for example, in upstate New York, what's happening with the building of a semiconductor industry from the ground up. That's a 10-year process. Big sea changes, like the one we're going through, are complicated. They're complicated to message. It's hard to say we're moving from one political economy to another. That's not something that you message on Fox or MSNBC.
Biden's new economic worldview hasn't been at the center of most political coverage. Instead, we get coverage like this.
During his speech, the president made a gaffe, saying, quote, "Let me start off with 2 words.
Made in America. Made in America."
But there is a coherent policy experiment happening here, a response to decades of neoliberal economics. Whether voters choose to continue that experiment could dramatically shape the future of the American economy.
So I think after one term of Trump and one term of Biden, we have a decent sense of how they're going to govern. Trump broke with the neoliberal era when it came to trade, but he kept in place a lot of neoliberal policies like cutting taxes for the rich and deregulation.
We've tried neoliberalism. What happened during those 45 years was that wages stagnated, Wall Street exploded, big banks got bailouts. Most Americans really came out on the short end. And it pains me to say this because I was part of previous administrations. I was in the Carter administration. I was Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration. I think that these administrations accomplished a lot of good things. But looking back historically, those administrations did not change the neoliberal consensus. Joe Biden is changing it.
The Western Empire is not spreading liberalism. They are crushing liberty, freedom, democracy everywhere they go. The United States has special ops forces, meaning intelligence and military operations, in more countries than they have embassies. The U.S. has carried out at least 469 military interventions since 1798, but more than half of those have been carried out in just the last 30 years. They are spreading neoliberalism, not liberalism. And these two ideologies couldn't be more different. And they're not spreading it by discourse and dialogue in the so-called marketplace of ideas. They're spreading it through force and violence on a scale unparalleled in human history. And you can go back as far as you want or as recently as you want. If you want to go as far as Nagasaki, Hiroshima, you can go there. If you want to go to slavery, you can go there. If you want to go to the genocide of the Native Americans, you can go there. And if you want to just talk more recently, you can talk about Iraq. You can talk about Afghanistan. You can talk about Syria. You can talk about Yemen. You can talk about drone attacks in Pakistan. You can talk about bombing the pharmaceutical factory in Sudan. And that's just against us. Forget about talking about Latin America in the 1970s, 1980s, and now. They're spreading it through military invasion, occupation, and intimidation, and through economic sabotage, bullying, and debt slavery. The Muslim world and the entire global South see it. They know it. They experience it. They are suffering from it. Nobody is fooled by the propaganda. The West is not teaching the world, certainly not the Muslim world, about the value of individual liberty or the sacredness of the individual or about the rule of law or any of the other principles that are associated with liberalism. We have to fight the West in order to establish these principles in our societies. And these are principles that we understood centuries before the Enlightenment. You must have had your head buried in the amber waves of grain if you actually imagine that the West invented or discovered the concept of individual rights and civil liberties and freedom. The people in the West are allowed to do as they please. They're allowed to fornicate, they're allowed to drink, they're allowed to commit sodomy, they're allowed to play games about what gender is, they're allowed to indulge in absolute moral relativism, precisely because they are inconsequential to those in power. Your only role in the society is to contribute to corporate profits, to be a consumer and to be a worker. That's all. Therefore, anything else you want to do with your life doesn't matter to anyone who matters. Liberalism is a euphemism for the complete irrelevance of the morality, the decency, or the refinement of the population, because you don't matter. If your immorality and your indecency is profitable, it's approved. Nobody cares about you being a good person because you don't have any power. And what you call liberalism, which is actually just the complete indifference of power to the lives of the population, yes, this has wrought havoc on the societies. And this havoc is profitable. And it helps to consolidate the power of those who possess power because the population remains marginalized, distracted, and confused, and entertained, and engaged in futile activities. The power of the West has not been achieved by virtue or by the superiority of their ideas. It has been achieved through brutal, savage violence, both military and economic. It doesn't finish the atrocities committed by the United States and endlessly defended until now. Defended by the government and justified by the government, justified by the media, justified by pundits, justified by analysts, justified by think tanks. There's no conscience there. Don't you feel bad about what you did? Why don't you have to explain to us that those actions don't represent your belief system? The same way that we have to explain to you when renegade criminals perform acts of terror, we have to explain to you that those actions do not represent our belief system. But you never have to explain to us, to assure us that violence and atrocities and war crimes, that's not what America stands for. That's not what the West stands for. That's not what liberal values means. That's a misrepresentation. And you can't explain it that way because the representatives of liberal democracy, the representatives of the West, the representatives of America, they're the ones who are performing those actions. Those aren't the actions of renegade criminals. This is the actions of the government. This is the difference between civilized people and savage people. This is the difference between a normal, healthy human being and a psychopath. That's the difference between the Muslim world and the West.
The first problem for the Middle East is that they don't have economic independence, nothing remotely like it. The only country with a little bit of exception to that, just a little, is Israel. Why? Because of their peculiar relationship, A, to Jews and B, to the United States, which gives them a whole lot of money for nothing, just out of a kind of solidarity. You are our baby. You are our friend. You are our fellow Jew. You are our whatever however they conceptualize it, there's a load of opportunity, cash, business deals, all kinds of things that are available to them through that contact that are not available yet to the others. Israel is a model for the United States. What is it doing? It's trying to hold on to a colonial situation. The epithet that many use against Israel, that you are an example of settler colonialism, that's correct. That's right. They are. They're not different in that way from Rhodesia or South Africa. And what happened to all of them? Whoops. Israel is arguably one of the last remaining settler colonialisms where the fight is still going on between the settlers and the people they displaced.
Neoliberalism is one of those words that can mean a lot of different things. So what is neoliberalism? The short answer is that it's a type of late-stage capitalism. The long answer is that the term neoliberalism was actually coined in 1938, I believe, by Hayek. The current neoliberal era began in the 1970s when Reagan and Thatcher were in power. In contrast to Keynesianism, which is a type of capitalism that's typically associated with social safety nets and business regulation by the government, neoliberalism is primarily driven by the free market. So as an economic system, neoliberalism is characterized by a few things: austerity measures, privatization of public goods and services, and deregulation of business. All of these are driven by the idea of market supremacy, that the state shouldn't intervene at all and we should just let the market and competition run its course. What's important to note is that neoliberalism is spread by force and imperialism. International bodies like the IMF often use conditional aid to force countries in the global south to adopt neoliberal policies. Basically, slash your healthcare budget or we won't give you any aid. A lot of times when people use the word neoliberalism, they're referencing social or cultural impacts like the idolization of the individual, which I'm also happy to talk about more if that's something that people want.
Welcome to 60-Second Marxism. Today we discuss neoliberalism. After World War II, Western capitalism was able to give workers many concessions, particularly in Europe, with the welfare state, healthcare, etc. due to the large growth in the economy. Keynesian economics became the dominant ideology of capitalism with large government spending, regulation, and intervention in the markets to prevent the extreme economic ups and downs that had been synonymous with the previous period. However, by the 70s, this growth had slowed and we saw the first globalized crisis of capitalism. This shock allowed the reemergence of 19th century liberal ideas. They were on the one hand correct that state intervention had not solved capitalism's tendency to fail, though contradictorily they proposed going back to the previous ideology of the state taking a hands-off approach, privatization of state-owned industry, opening up markets and a wholesale bonfire of regulation, which itself had created far larger amounts of boom and bust in the past. The neoliberal ideas were not popular with the general public, but saw growing popularity with the ruling class and their politicians because as their profits were being hit they no longer could make the concessions they had made after the war. The first neoliberal experiments were tried out in Chile. The USA helped fund a coup against the democratically elected socialist leader Salvador Allende and installed Augusto Pinochet. Here they implemented huge privatizations of state-owned industry, opening up of the markets to global capital, banning trade unions and mass deregulation to disastrous effects. Pinochet murdered thousands of socialists in the country, and the economic turmoil unleashed by these reforms was devastating to the living standards of the people. It did, however, make those capitalists the country was opened up to wildly wealthy. So was seen as a success in spite of Chile being forced to roll back many of the reforms as they simply did not work. Neoliberalism was rolled out and forced on many poor countries first with similar effect. It was rolled out across the West particularly enthusiastically by Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the USA. All with similar effects of a huge transfer of wealth to the rich with less and less investment in public services and infrastructure. In my next video, I will discuss how this all came crashing down in 2008 and the dead end of reformism. Public ownership and planning the economy saw huge increases in living standards, but if you do not get rid of capitalism, the same problems inevitably rise.
Welcome to Roughly 60-Second Marxism. Today we discuss the 2008 financial crisis. In 2008, we saw the largest economic crash in world history. This shook the neoliberal consensus that the market knows best. It opened up huge divisions in the ruling class about the causes and how to respond. Economists were, and still are, baffled because any real analysis would bring the viability of capitalism into question. The crisis started with Lehman Brothers collapsing during the subprime mortgage scandal. A domino effect saw many other financial institutions collapsing around the globe. What we saw in 2008 was the result of capitalism's tendency to overproduce finally catching up with it. The banks had allowed a staggering amount of lending to pile up in order to push the market beyond its limits. The capitalist government's solution to this was the mass bailing out of banks, which was supposed to be paid for with the huge cuts to public services that they carried through. However, debt is higher than ever, and investment and productivity are still stagnant. Other measures governments have used to try and give the system space to recover include quantitative easing, i.e. printing money, and lowering interest rates to unprecedented low levels when growth was sluggish. Therefore, kicking the can down the road. The expected magic solution has not happened, and we are about to see the replay of 2008, made worse by even more debt than in 2008. Unlike before, there are very few tools to counter the problems. Interest rates have been so low for such a long time it has simply intensified the amount of debt in the economy and caused mass inflation. Combined with no wage growth, we now have stagflation. So on the one hand, it's quite correct to say it was insane to bail out the banks, print money, and lower interest rates to such low levels, which has caused huge inflation. But what would have been the alternative, under capitalism, if we had done what libertarians would have wished, letting everything go to the wall? It would have created untold amounts of economic turmoil and human suffering, causing massive social explosions and the total collapse of capitalism. The only way to overcome this endless boom and ever more extreme bust is for capitalism to be overthrown and a sensibly planned democratic socialist economy created.
You're absolutely right. 2008-2009 was a gigantic crisis that is comparable to 1929, unlike today. But when it comes to actual banks failing, it is, I think, absolutely right to say that this time we should be more worried about our banks, because in 2007, 2008, 2009, when regulators and authorities looked into the books of the banks that were failing back then, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Bank of America, Barclays, Royal Bank of Scotland, and so on, they discovered gigantic amounts of fraud. Remember the predatory lending, all the subprime mortgages that were given to people who could never repay them, and that was done knowingly. That's what I mean by predatory lending. The derivatives that were falsely labeled as AAA rated by credit rating. There was a lot of fraud and a lot of quasi-criminal behavior. Also, the regulation mechanism was very weakened by the Clinton administration. Today, when we look at the account books of the Silicon Valley Bank or even Credit Suisse, we find much higher capitalization, next to no fraud, some silly decisions regarding risk-taking, but nothing resembling the shenanigans that were the cause of the house of cards falling one after the other in 2007, 2008. That should make us worried, because the rules were more or less respected by the banks that are failing today. Look at Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank is far better behaved today than it was in 2007, 2008. That is leading me to the conclusion that this domino effect, which is causing our central banks to lose sleep and to come in with the heavy weaponry of bailouts, this crisis should make us more worried, because this is much more of a systemic crisis and less the result of serial fraud.
Last night, I started off by researching Hooters getting bankrupted by private equity and ended up uncovering the next 2008 level economic collapse. And they're hiding the bubble inside a private equity black box that makes it almost impossible to see what they're doing. Almost. This time, they're not going to collapse the banks and make it too big to fail. They're going to bankrupt the entire American pension system. I'm almost too afraid to make this video, but it has to be done, so let's get into it. In 2008, investors and bankers were able to crash the world's economy by engaging in risky, unethical bets and investments, and they did it right out in the open. They've learned, and this time they're doing it again. Bigger investments, bigger risks, same playbook, but they're doing it behind the smokescreen of private equity in bigger numbers. They're creating a bigger bubble than before, and it's not somewhere down the road. It's here, and it's about to pop. You see, for the last month, I've been trying to figure out why these companies that private equity had acquired were failing even though they were still succeeding. Joann's, 97% of their stores are still profitable, and yet they're still bankrupt. But they weren't bankrupt a year ago, and they still had the debt that private equity had stacked on them a year ago. So I wanted to know what changed. The same thing with Hooters. The same thing with... Now in 2024, private equity bankrupted 110 businesses. And that was almost double their previous record. There had been huge increases in the amount of bankruptcies each year over the past 3 years. But I didn't know what had changed because private equity had held many of these businesses for several years and they were still succeeding. Until I got my hands on an economic report and an article and found a term that nobody could explain to me. The term was back-floating rate loans. I didn't know what that meant, and no article would explain it to me. So I had to go and do research in the financial prospectuses of a bunch of financial investment firms. Guys, in the last few years, private equity has taken out $3.8 trillion in adjustable rate loans. These are adjustable rate loans. These private equity firms took out adjustable rate loans. And so for the last 3 years, as our interest rates have gone up, every 30 to 60 days, the money due on the loans they stacked on top of these companies has gone up every 30 to 60 days. That's why these successful companies that private equity had acquired are suddenly bankrupt, even though they're still making money. They're bankrupt because they're paying adjustable rate loans. But it doesn't stop there. It gets so much worse because my next question is, why are the banks willing to give these risky loans to these private equity firms knowing it's going to cause them to fail? And the answer is because the banks aren't going to keep them on their books. The banks are immediately repackaging these adjustable rate loans as something called CLOs, right? Which are then packaged and sold off to our pension funds as really great debt. And they tell them that it's a diversified portfolio. Are you hearing The Big Short in real time? Literally, all of these companies are getting bankrupted in greater and greater numbers. And all of this debt is adjustable rate. And all of the bankruptcies are skyrocketing in this direction. And if you look at this graph, you can see that aside from 2020, which is obviously an anomaly, right now, private equity, that's the yellow section, has double the highest number of bankruptcies they'd ever had prior to last year. And that number is climbing this year, $3.8 trillion. $3.8 trillion in this debt, okay? I want you to look back to 2008. Do you want to know how many risky adjustable rate mortgages there were? $1.1 trillion. Do you want to know how many subprime but not quite as bad loans there were? $1.3 trillion. That was just in housing. In the $3.8 trillion held by private equity, they own the largest shares of the home ownership market in the United States, but they also own the daycares. They own the veterinary clinics. They own the pet stores. They own the nursing homes. They own the emergency rooms. They own the doctor's offices, the orthodontists. They own the builders. They own the HVAC companies. This isn't just housing. It's going to touch every single industry around us. And that is why, if this were a free market and private equity had not exploitatively gotten involved, if we had a free market and we could see what they were doing, these companies would be succeeding. If this were actually a free market, these companies would be succeeding. Joann's has 97% of their stores profitable. That is an astronomical number. 97% of a retail store is profitable. And they are failing and they are closing every store. And it is further consolidating an already consolidated environment. And now there are thousands and thousands of employees that will not have jobs. And there are thousands of other businesses that are going through the exact same thing right now. And why? Because they know we will never allow the banks to be bailed out again. We would literally riot in the streets. But we're definitely going to allow them to bail out the pensions because that's our grandparents. That's our parents. That's the working class. They know that this will get bailed out. And because there's no regulatory authority, there are no laws stopping private equity from doing whatever they want, they know they can get away with it. And we can't do anything to stop them. The most important thing you need to understand is this wasn't done by accident. This was done by blatant, intentional greed. The private equity firms wanted the cheapest debt they could get, and they believed, arrogantly, that the debt would stay cheap forever. They had 0% interest rate loans for ages. And so they took on these adjustable rate notes thinking they could keep refinancing forever out of it. It was arrogant. But it also meant that they got to collect bigger fees because they were taking risky debt that cost less. The bankers were happy to give them because they got higher fees on offering bad debt. They were going to get paid no matter what. At the same time, the private equity firms mandated in their contracts with these companies they acquired that they were advisors and that they were a management company. So they also get paid that way. And then they sold the land out from under these companies and all their assets and made themselves whole before any of this even began. They're already cash positive. The banks knew they wouldn't be held accountable because they were going to bundle it up and pass it off to the pensions. And even the pensions were reckless because they're buying these mechanisms because when you purchase into private equity, when you purchase private equity debt as a pension, you get to put on your books, especially if you have an underfunded pension, the projected gains for 10 years, which means for 10 years, it looks like that pension is more shored up than it is. And at the end of that 10 years, when it's time for that fund to close out, suddenly then all of the bad debt comes crashing down on the pension. But at that point, there's a new leader on the pension fund and they've kicked the can down the road. So even they were reckless. But at the bottom of all of this is the bankrupting of the fabric of our society. We are losing our businesses. We are losing our doctors. We are losing our orthodontists. We are losing our nursing homes. We are losing our funeral homes. And one by one, they're going to fall under the weight of this really horrible adjustable rate debt. And nobody is talking about it. I could only find 2 articles in very obscure financial magazines that even talk about these back floating rate loans. I have never been more terrified. And I talk about private equity a lot. I have a lot to say. But right now, all I want to do is get someone to pay attention that can make a difference in this because we have a problem. We're not without any hope at all. Right now, private equity is only allowed to be this exploitative because they exist under something called the carried interest loophole, something that multiple Congresses have tried to close, but private equity continues to bribe politicians to fail to actually achieve. Trump, 3 weeks ago, said he wanted to close the carried interest loophole. I thought he was doing it as a fundraising maneuver. But he's doubled down on it repeatedly. If we can make enough noise about this, maybe we can get him to actually see it through and end private equity's stranglehold on our population. There's so much more that we have to go through, so this is going to be a multi-part series. But if you're new here, my name is Tiffany. We work together to fight private equity and save small businesses in our community, and it's going to take every single one of us to do so. So do all the things and stick around. I'm so glad you're here.
Over the last century, the United States and Britain championed a particular way of organizing an economy, private capitalism. The Soviet Union for 70 years championed an alternative, state capitalism, where the state plays the role of owner, operator of the enterprise. The state owns it legally, and the state puts its people, officials, in the position, they're called the Council of Ministers, but it's in the position of boards of directors that are state officials. They're put there because the state owns the business. There is no stock market. You don't buy and sell shares in the Soviet Union because it's not how they do it. But it's capitalism because it's a small group of employers with an army of employees, just like it's slavery when you have a master and a slave. No one gives a damn and they analyze slavery, whether that's a private corporation or a government that owns the slaves. It's slavery either way. And feudalism is the same. You could have a private lord with serfs and a governmental lord with serfs. It's feudalism. But here in the United States, when we have capitalism, We make a mountain out of the difference between the private and the state. The state we give another name to. We didn't give another name in slavery. We didn't give another name in feudalism. But in capitalism, we give another. It's socialism.
Why are so many people in the younger generations turning to socialism and communism? Well, for the last 45 years in the US and UK, we've been moving towards what's called neoliberalism. And this is an economic and political system based on unregulated capitalism. Freedom for capitalists to trade and invest, and very few legislations or social programs that help the workers, like say minimum wage or free healthcare. Instead, in a neoliberal system, the healthcare system belongs to the capitalist. This is also what Ronald Reagan, one of the fathers of neoliberalism, called trickle-down economics, and it was embraced by the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, Margaret Thatcher. You can also refer to these two as the devil. But anyway, since those two were in office, CEO pay has skyrocketed 1,460%, to the point where CEOs are now being paid 399 times more than their workers, whose wages have largely remained stagnant, especially in relation to the cost of living, which is consistently increasing. Just look at the yearly increases that we're paying in rent. So with these worsening material and economic conditions, a lot of young people are noticing the contradictions and problems with capitalism, especially unregulated neoliberal capitalism. It's left so many young Americans without health care, burdened with debt, and seeing no economic future for themselves. That's exactly what capitalism does when you let capitalists have all the power and all the wealth, obviously. Who ever thought trickle-down would work? It even sounds like a scam. But anyways, young people who like socialism, you have the right idea. Don't let them gaslight you and tell you that socialism has never worked or that it can't work in the future. It has and it will. Check out MidwesternMarks.com and the Midwestern Marks YouTube to start learning theory, organizing, and overthrowing the neoliberal capitalist system. Let's go.
There has been a period of 45 years of what amounts to savage class war against the general population. It's bipartisan, led by Republicans, started with Ronald Reagan, followed by Bill Clinton, Obama. It's called neoliberalism. The definition of neoliberalism, you look it up in the dictionary, it says something about free markets, free enterprise. That's not what it is. It's basically class war. So yes, there is deregulation, but there's a footnote. Deregulation leads to financial crashes very quickly. In fact, the business world understands that the way it works is get deregulation, we move towards monopolization quite naturally. We make risky investments, make a ton of money. When it all crashes, the state comes in and the friendly taxpayer bails us out. We're seeing it right now, in fact, but it happens over and over. So it's a market bailout economy for the very rich.
In the decades before the collapse of the 1930s, we had the same redistribution. It blew up, and then in the 1930s, there was the reverse, the redistribution down. So what happened in the 1930s? Just remember our history. You taxed corporations and the rich in a way you hadn't before. And what did you do with the money? You created the Social Security system, which gives to everybody who reaches age 65 a pension. We passed the first minimum wage in the United States in the 1930s. We passed unemployment compensation for the first time in American history in the 1930s. And the big one, I haven't even mentioned, the federal government hired 15 million people who were unemployed and now had a job. That was a radical redistribution of wealth and income down to offset the explosion when it went too far up. You know where we are now? Too far up.
The neoliberal shift wasn't actually about shrinking the state. What it was about crushing collective power. And you see this with like the first moves that politicians like Thatcher and Reagan undertake when they come into power. It was crush the labor movement. And there was a discourse that surrounded this as well. So there was the physical assertion of the power of the state. There was the literal beating up of miners, the use of the police to put them in their place. But there was this ideological shift as well, which was you are not a worker, you are not a citizen, you are a consumer. A lot of the problems that we have in our society today, whether it's like, you know, the crazy stuff that you see on social media, whether it's this sense of powerlessness, whether it's even like, you know, low pay as a result of people not being able to organize, they all come back to this question of individualism. And you hear this, particularly among young people, there's a sense that when things go wrong, it's your own fault. You have no one to blame but yourself. And I think this is really like damaging people's mental health. There's this sense of like deep and profound shame at not being able to compete in the same way as maybe those around you. All of this comes back to this shift that was at the heart of neoliberalism, which is that there's no such thing as society, which is what Thatcher said. It's all just a collection of isolated individuals competing against each other. And I mean, to illustrate what this means for our sense of our own power within the system, think about, you know, like 50, 60 years ago, if you as a worker were dissatisfied with your pay, or, you know, you went home and you couldn't put food on the table, you would have gone into your workplace, chatted with your co-workers, chatted with your union rep and said, look, like, are you in the same position as me? Because I can't afford to feed my kids. And they would have been like, yeah, you're right. Okay, well, we need to do something about this. We need to go on strike and organize because our boss is exploiting us. Today, if you can't put food on the table, what do? You blame yourself. You maybe go out and get a personal loan at a very high interest rate. Some people become depressed because they're like, I can't afford to feed my family. I'm a loser. There's no sense of your, you know, collective power, or indeed the way in which you are being exploited because of your position within the system.
Do you see anything on the horizon that might break us out of this?
The only weapon we have left by which we can begin to push back against these forces is organized labor and strikes. And we do see movement. Unfortunately, we just watched the Biden administration revoke the collective bargaining power of the railroad union, one of the few unions that retain that right. So we know where the Democrats are from, but I would say strike, strike, strike. That history has shown that is an effective weapon and the only one we have left.
The government's run by the few and the special interests, not the people, and so on. You know, they're not wrong. This is all happening to them. And the answers that they're getting from, say, you know, Rush Limbaugh, Michael Savage, the rest of them, are, well, we have an answer. The rich liberals own everything. They own the corporations. They run the government. They run the media. And they don't care about people like you. They don't care about the flyover people between the East Coast and the West Coast. They only care about giving everything you work for away to, you know, to illegal immigrants or, you know, gays or something. So we got to protect ourselves from them. And furthermore, they run the government. When they put up a health program, it's not to give you health. It's to kill your granny. You know? And that's an answer to something. It's a terrible answer, but it is an answer. And if you do suspend disbelief, you forget about what's happening in the world, really, it's a coherent answer. Now, they're not hearing anything else. And the memory that comes to my mind, again, I don't want to press the analogy too hard, but I think it's worth thinking about, is late Weimar Germany. There were people with real grievances. The Nazis gave them an answer. It's the fault of the Jews and the Bolsheviks, and we got to protect ourselves from them. And that'll take care of your grievances. And we know what happened. Germany in the 1920s was, you know, the most civilized, the peak of Western civilization in the arts and the sciences, highly democratic, functioning democratic institutions. A decade later, it was, you know, the pits of human history. Again, the analogy is it's not close, but it's frightening. And unless an answer can be given to these people, unless they can be led to understand what's really happening to them, we could be in for trouble.
Young people have every reason to be enraged, and every issue they see, they look up, they get angry, and they see someone doing better than them, and then every day it is speedballed in their face that they are failing, that they are not doing as well as everyone around them. For the first time in our nation's history, a 30-year-old man or woman isn't doing as well as his or her parents were at 30. That is the social compact breaking down. People aged 30 to 34, 60% of them in 1990 had one child. Now it's 27%. People are opting out of America. They're not optimistic about it. They're not having kids. They look up, they see wealth, exceptional wealth across my generation and people in certain industries, and they are really struggling. Their purchasing power is going down, and the incumbents create artificial scarcity on campus. The incumbents who already have a degree see their degree go up in value. We get very concerned with housing and traffic once we own a housing. Housing permits are sequestered from young people. Housing prices have gone from $290 to $420 in the last 4 years. So a young person, a house, stocks that I don't own skyrocket in value. Let's have COVID relief and flush the markets and take assets way up, because if 1 million people dying would be bad, would be tragic if I got less wealthy. And we're doing it on their credit card. We have lost the script. Our kids are more anxious and more depressed and more obese and more addicted. And we have made a purposeful decision to let this happen by ensuring the people around this table stay wealthy at the cost of young people.
Young men are not going to the Republican Party. What I would argue is that they're leaving the Democratic Party, because if you go to the DNC, the Democratic Party's website, there's a section that says who we serve. Click on it. And it says, these are the constituents in America that we serve, that we advocate for. And it lists 16 demographic groups, ranging from Asians and Pacific Islanders, the disabled, seniors, Black Americans, veterans. It goes through all of these groups, and I think it adds up to 76% of the U.S. population. But similar to kind of the DEI apparatus on campus now, when you're purposely advocating and trying to advantage 76% of the population, you're not advantaging 76% of the population or advocating for them. You're discriminating against the 24%. And that 24% are squarely one group. It's young men. And if you look at the Democratic National Convention, it was a parade of demographic groups, but not one mentioned the group that has fallen furthest, fastest in the United States, and that's young men.
What are the larger phenomena that are at play here that may make her be noteworthy in some way that we might imagine discussing 6 months from now? Well, first and foremost is the fact that she's female. And secondarily, that she's a brown female. This is in our culture, this is extremely important, that it is possible for a female, let alone a brown female, to be in this position, that this is possible. An enormous part of our population can't digest this, will vote against her because of it, or not vote at all because of it. It's particularly hard for men who have all kinds of problems, but particularly these days, problems with black or brown, and with women. You know, as a professor, we are watching in our classrooms an unbelievable shift. When I began teaching economics, it would not be uncommon for me to have 25 men and 4 or 5 women in a classroom. That would not be unusual. Now it's the reverse. Women outnumber men in colleges and universities in America for the first time. And the gap between them is getting larger with each passing semester. I mean, the culture is shifting, the values are shifting, the attitudes are shifting, and she's a reflection of that, and she will carry that. It's not accidental that her number one issue is abortion. I mean, yes, that's possible. And if she wins, it will be, in my judgment, because she gets a wildly disproportionate vote from women and female black and brown people. It's not so clear with the male black and brown. That cuts the other way because they're male.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not up to date on the polling numbers.
The polls show that. So I think she is another step in the breakdown of those hierarchies, but it means she's also another step in provoking the white supremacy and the horror of the part of the population that was brought up to believe that the order of the universe has them above them, and that doesn't look like it if you have an Obama. Look, Trump is in office in part because of the reaction against Obama. That seems clear to me. She's going to provoke that too. And she's going to have to manage that, the way Obama struggled to manage that. So that's one thing. More mysterious, because she's unknown, more mysterious is what will be the impact, so very different from anybody who's come before.
Today, a group known as the Patriot Front was seen marching around Des Moines' East Village. The demonstration drew concern from some witnesses who posted these videos on social media. Now, according to the group's website, they are a white nationalist group with goals to reclaim America for the European race. The group also posted a message on Telegram this afternoon saying, quote, activists are currently demonstrating in Des Moines, Iowa in protest to the mass migration of unassimilable foreigners who have invaded America.
This country was headed down a very bad track, and the whole DEI thing
That was a trap. That was a sick trap. And, we've destroyed that. That's gone. That's pretty much gone.
Hey, stop saying DEI is being rolled back. That's not what's going on. Be honest. Say white supremacy is on the rise. I mean, just be real. That's what we're doing here. We're giving power to white people. This is not about meritocracy. It's about pushing back on the idea that black and brown people should be part of the fabric of the country. This is about white entitlement, like that job is supposed to be mine. This is about assuming white superiority and feeding white victimhood and coddling white fragility. You don't have to be in the Klan to perpetuate or even enjoy white supremacy. The benefits of white privilege fall upon people who are not in the Klan just as well as people who are in the Klan. All of this is about liberating white people from the idea that they need to include marginalized people. This is all about a revenge of white people. You could say it's about a response to Obama and affirmative action and white people reasserting their power. But if you look back through history, it's constantly white people saying, we've given them too much. Years ago, there was a Harvard study called White People See Race as a Zero-Sum Game That They Are Losing. Diversity and inclusion has been seen as taking something away from whiteness.
So who's the real victim of Project 2025? Because when you think about this, they lure these poor people in because they're uneducated and doing away with the Department of Education when white people need it the most. But it don't matter because information and education, that's a kryptonite to them. They don't want to learn. They don't want to do better, right? Get rid of the Department of Education. Start rolling back on Social Security and social programs, welfare, food stamps. They're overwhelmingly on it, dependent upon it, running these farms in these rural countries, using Mexicans for cheap labor, not only under construction, but to pick their produce. Losing that. Going to lose the farm. Heavily invested in crypto, heavily invested in the stock market. Think, oh, Donald Trump, he's a businessman. Stock market's plummeting, losing money, losing millions. And black people is out here on trail rides clapping fans. Because how do we can no longer concern ourselves, bruh. Y'all are the victims of this thing. And because it's being telegraphed that we're the ones that's going to be the victims, when we talking about rolling back DEI, well, that just means niggas, even though we're the fifth and who benefits from it, and white women benefit from it the most. When you say woke, they put their life on easy mode to keep them mediocre. We're going to make everything easy for you. We're going to make sure when you get the job, you get the most money. We're going to make sure when you go to get the house, no issues. We're going to make sure when you go to the bank, no issues. We're going to make sure when you get pulled over by the police, no issues. You live your life on easy so I can keep you mediocre. This idea of supremacy is a fallacy that's orchestrated for control. And they got your mind fucked up and you think you're superior because you're white. So when they really put the play down, you're too weak to fight back. You don't have any organization. That's why your protest looks like a parade. It hasn't even been 90 days. You already regretting the decision that niggas told you. We told you. So niggas say, you know what? Fuck it. Done talking. That's y'all problem now. We're going to go over here and do our thing. We're going to make sure that we enroll in self-defense classes. We're going on group hikes. We're going on trail rides. We're going to continue to have fun. We're going to continue because guess what? Par for course. Par for course. You want to roll back on the DEI initiative target? We taking the money out of there. Young black men at Michigan, University of Michigan, they want to roll back on DEI initiatives, hit that transfer portal. Because those sports teams ain't doing shit without niggas. Trust me. You want to see 5 white men on the basketball court? You want to see 22 white men on the football field? Have at it. Niggas gonna be in everything.
The United States will be the crypto capital of the planet and the Bitcoin superpower of the world, and we'll get it done.
Do you want to know why Bitcoin is banned in China? It's because it's a scam. It's like a biggest scam there is. The idea is great, the tech is great, but we just use it to scam each other. Like we're literally is like the biggest pyramid scheme, and we're all in it together. That's weird.
Hey there, world. So I wrote a blog post earlier today, and I wanted to share it with the digital world over here. So I have some notes here, and I might be looking down, but I wanted to share it with you here on this world. So have you ever noticed how the most ridiculous over-the-top freakouts happen right before someone loses control completely? There's actually a name for this. It's called extinction burst. And basically, it's a behavior that gets way more intense right before it disappears forever. And that's exactly what we're seeing in politics, in religious institutions, and in power-hungry groups that just can't handle the change. So let's take MAGA, for example. The racism, the bigotry, the fear. It's all dialed up to like cartoonish level villainry right now because they know the world is changing. More people of color, LGBTQ folks, and marginalized communities are getting equal rights. They're gaining power and existing without their permission, and they just hate it. And so they're throwing a tantrum and trying to drag us all back to 1952. The same thing with the Utah legislature. Power grab after power grab after power grab. It's like they looked around and thought, hey, democracy is cool and all, but have we considered just not doing it? They see their control slipping, and they're just scrambling to rig the game before they're completely outnumbered. And then there's the LDS Church. Whew. If you've been paying attention for the last 20 years, you've seen them spiral. Every time society takes a step forward towards LGBTQ rights, racial equality, or just questioning authority, they dig their heels in like a toddler, refusing to eat their vegetables. Their institutional influence, it's shrinking, and they know it. And so they're clamping down harder and harder, hoping nobody notices the cracks in the foundation. But here's the thing. This isn't strength. It's desperation. Extinction bursts are the last-ditch efforts. They're losing. They're dying. It's a dying grasp from people who know that they're losing, but they would rather light everything on fire than escape the inevitability. So, look, history has already told us how this all ends. Progress always wins. Civil rights, marriage equality, freedom of thought, these aren't fads. They are the future. The freakouts. That's what's temporary. Now, unfortunately, through the rest of all of this, the rest of us have to deal with their nonsense. They're not just screaming into the void. They're wrecking laws. They're harming communities, causing real damage on their way out. And it's like the old saying goes, when my house burns, so does yours. I just wish we could fast forward past this mess and get to this Star Trek future that we were all promised. You know, the one where humanity actually evolves and we're out exploring the stars together. Instead, we're stuck in some cursed Birth of a Nation reboot that none of us have really asked for. But hey, remember this. History is on our side, and let's just make sure we learn to tell it. I hate this timeline. Anyways, see you next time.
Surprised at the number of people who think that we can go backward socially, culturally, and still move forward economically and strategically. Remember once I was at this big Army strategy event, and we were talking about the way forward to be more successful, and some of that has to do with strategy, some of that has to do with the money part of being financially successful and sustainable, and another part of it has to be the leadership culture and the social culture that we build in our organization. I'm surprised at the number of people who have this sort of romantic idea of what things used to be like and how that would be better, and we should go back to those things, and they don't realize that it never works that way. Any organization who goes backward socially, culturally, also goes backward financially, also goes backward strategically. The game is to move forward. Take the good things that are part of your culture and move it forward, not backward.
Let me reach over here and put on my red MAGA hat for a second. I'm going to represent the position of Trump, potentially.
Good.
Yeah, we're cutting taxes for the richest among us. Yes, we're giving more and more benefits to corporations, but that will create jobs. That will allow us to take risks. That will allow us to spark innovation. That will allow us to create the next big market that will allow for, more wealth for everybody. If we build a new internet, if we build a new auto industry, if we build a new thing, everybody gets a job, everybody wins, more money's on the table.
This was a reasonable argument. I don't think it was ever true. I'm a professor of economics. I've studied it all my life. What you're saying is a nice way, a better way than they usually do, for what used to be called trickle-down economics. You help the folks at the top, you boost the profits, you give them a tax cut, and it'll trickle down to a good job for me and all that. I'm going to be more nice now than I ought to be. There was a grain of truth to that, but it isn't anymore. And that's perhaps the most important thing that I can tell you. And I'll say it as bluntly as I know how. The American empire is over. We're done. We peaked about 12, 15 years ago, and we are on a down. And it's very hard for the American people, which I understand. I am one. It's hard to get your head around that. We've had a century of on the way up, which is a lot more fun than on the way down. But it does happen to every empire. We're only the latest. Look at the British, how far they've fallen. We're in that process. So the problem with the trickle down is, there might be more jobs, but they're going to be created in China. They're going to be created in Brazil. They're going to be created in India. They're not created here.
I don't know that everyone can see the pattern in what the Doge department that Elon Musk is running is actually about. They're basically just doing step 1, 2, 3, 4 of neoliberalism. They are taking the public government services, they're gutting those, they're removing the staff from any public spaces and public departments, and they're likely going to try to start replacing them with privatized solutions. We've already done this for healthcare. That's why we have private insurance marketplaces rather than something more expanded and beneficial and affordable than Obamacare. We've already done this with housing. This is why we have to fight for quote unquote affordable housing rather than looking at the fact that housing shouldn't be unaffordable. We've privatized the right of housing that people should have as a human right and as a citizen right. And we sent it to the private markets. When it comes to education, right, we know the public school infrastructure in America is not that strong and it's increasingly non-competitive on the global marketplace and stage. And instead of actually solving for public education, we instead fight against education unions and fight against funding more teachers and funding these things. And if you can afford to send your kid perhaps to a private school, a Montessori school, or these sorts of things, well, then you can get a good education. And if we do want to keep funding public education, well, we're going to bring in some private donors. Like in Illinois, we have Governor Rauner for Rauner College Prep, and we have the Pritzker schools, and these sorts of, these are private rich people who have paid for schools and are donors. And these things should be paid for by taxes from all of us. But we're trying to find more private solutions. And that's because we believe in America that you can solve everything with a business. So just look for that pattern, y'all. Recognize where in your own life and beliefs you believe that. And don't be so shocked when you see these things. Like, if you don't know what neoliberalism is, check out a book, read some stuff by Richard Reich, former labor secretary for the United States. Check out some stuff on socialism, and you'll be able to see the strategy in what's happening.
It's over. The empire is on its way down. You can live with that. You can make that decline manageable. You can avoid a trauma, or you cannot. For every example of an empire that went down traumatically, I can give you one that didn't, and vice versa. That's a choice we have if we take it seriously, which our leaders do not. The unthought through strategy of Mr. Trump doesn't yet take into account that there's another competitor who can buy if you don't, who can sell if you don't. You're not what you were. In the latter half of the 20th century, it all made a kind of sense. The United States says jump, and everybody asks how high. But we're not there. Nobody can afford to build houses in America now. Add 25% to the cost of lumber, kiss it goodbye. We have 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants. That's according to the Department of Homeland Security.
We are a population of 330 million Americans. Do the math. 10 to 12 of the poorest people in the country, those immigrants, are not the explanation for the economic difficulties of this rich country of 330 million people. The very idea of that is ridiculous. An undergraduate who wrote such a thing would be called in by their teacher and told, try to think through what you're saying. Supporting immigrants, but they're the ones who pick the fruits and vegetables upon which the Florida economy depends. But I have a solution. We're changing the law so children can go to work in the fields. That's the end of an empire. That's what happens. And no one says, boo. 14-year-olds will now be eligible to work until, I think, 9 at night. I mean, all kinds of things that the law forbade for children before. We're going to have child labor, and it's going to be good because, you see, you can pay the children as little as you got away with paying those immigrants. Jesus Christ. How many symptoms do you want to see before you go to the doctor? How many things are you going to face before you realize you got a different problem than the one you thought you had? And the BRICS is 55, I believe, percent of the world's people. The United States has 4.5% of the world's people. You can't overcome that. That's just light, that's light and day or whatever. It's just, you got to face this. You can't pretend you are not in the 1960s and 70s. You're just not. But we live in a country of denial. And what we got is a country and a leadership that is committed deep down to denial. It's like watching the Europeans now. They couldn't defeat the Russians with the Americans backing them up. The Americans have now pulled out, and they're babbling to one another how they're going to do it. That's a joke. Not even a good one. That's a joke. That's so pathetic, it's painful. It's embarrassing to watch you talk. Economically, the game is over. The Chinese, if not already a wealthier economic unit than we are, which they probably are, will be within a few years. Very few, like by the end of this decade, if not already. So economically, they are now our equal. But remember, they're our equal. They're going up, we're going down. We're equal, but the trajectory is unmistakable across the board. Right? And so politically, it comes right after that. If you're that powerful economically, if you're the place that the whole world goes to cut a deal because you get a better deal than you can get from Washington or London, which is now most of the time the case. That's why if you look at the biggest harbor being built in Africa, it's being built by the Chinese. If you look at the new railroads going across parts of Latin America, it's built by the Chinese. On and on and on. The Panama Canal, why does he want to take it? Well, the United States is the number one country using the Panama Canal. China's number two. China has built all these buildings to handle their shipping. It's everywhere, and once you start looking, you see it everywhere. But militarily, there's none of that. Americans have to understand, even if you don't agree with me, try to understand how the rest of the world looks at it. The United States maintains 750 military bases around the world. China doesn't have any.
I mean, just listen to little Marco Rubio. The Chinese are controlling this thing. The Chinese companies have taken over. The Chinese can shut down the Panama Canal, and 40% of our shipping goes through it. We can't allow this. We built it. Our blood. Our blah, 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 blah. Except here's the problem. China just built a multi-billion-dollar port in Peru. This is a port that's designed to maximize container trade. So giant, huge container ships are coming from China. They're going to come to this port, and this port is designed to get these containers off and onto high-speed rail lines that take them from Peru to Brazil. Now, if normally you're a Chinese container ship, you're going to come down and you're going to cross the Pacific, and then you're going to queue up at the Panama Canal, go through the Panama Canal, and then navigate up through the Caribbean Sea around South Africa, America, and you come to a Brazilian port. They just made the Panama Canal moot. China doesn't need the Panama Canal.
I've been very concerned lately about China and sort of we have transferred so much money from our economy over to China by buying all those things and supporting their economy over there so they could make more and more money. They are now all over Africa, buying things and investing over there and getting those countries dependent on them and supporting, non-democratic people. And I'm just
like
wondering,
whom?
Well,
we are in a country that supports Saudi Arabia.
Yes, that's true. Right. So
suddenly we have a problem with, superpowers supporting non-democratic people?
Yes, yes, I do, but I also am just concerned that we've sort of created the economic power that China sort of has now, and they're using it, I fear, going to be using it against us eventually and against the better interests of a lot of people.
Allow me to put your mind to rest.
Okay, great.
You shouldn't worry about that.
Okay.
It's very simple. And let me explain why you shouldn't worry about it. But please continue.
Well, they're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port.
And what's wrong with that?
And because
countries that need ports get ports.
But they're making people dependent on. I know it's the same thing that we've done, which is
no, it's
horrible
not.
Around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So.
Let me give you an example. Of course, they are peddling for influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they are non-interventionist. Absolutely non-interventionist in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom.
If China owns $800 billion of U.S. debt, which they do, then of course the United States, as the borrower, has to pay interest, which means that you and I and everybody else gets to pay taxes every year that go to Washington, where they don't fund our roads or schools or hospitals. It's money that the United States government collects and sends to Beijing to pay interest on the debt. And the Chinese use to develop the Red Army. You understand? All of this has to happen beneath the surface. Because if Americans understood what I just said, they would realize that beneath all the reality is the opposite. That's the reality of the economic of capitalism.
Do you know why the U.S. government is so inefficient? It's very simple. It's because everything is outsourced. Like from every single job is basically outsourced to a domestic or international company for bidding. Could you imagine you live at home and you're like, hey, I need to do this renovation and do a new kitchen. Yeah, sure, you might hire a general contractor to do it, but it gets pricey as opposed to you do the tiles and, you do the design and all that. But imagine everything's outsourced. Like everyday meal, every time you want to take out the garbage, you're hiring someone to hey, take out my garbage. That's where all our tax dollars are going to, like these independent companies and contractors that are being outsourced by our government. So there you go. Comment below.
Bingo. This is key. This is how China is succeeding in capitalism. In fact, this is what most European countries who are really good at this, they do this. The anti-monopoly. If you go to China, do you know how many TikTok Red Note apps out there? Hundreds. It's not one Instagram, one Facebook. There are a bunch of them everywhere. They're competing against each other. And the government allows that to create this kind of free market, quote unquote. They basically just let them hash it out and let them compete against each other. Yeah, that's how it works. That's how you run capitalist society.
if American manufacturers could make real money in the US, they would have already done it already. Let's be honest. Even when they bring factories back to the United States, it's not gonna be for the jobs. It's always for the capital. It's always for the gains. Everything will be automated. The bots don't need healthcare. The bots don't need lunch break. And yeah, people love blaming China, cheap labor this, unfair advantage that, but it's not just about wages. It's about infrastructures, high-speed trains, massive road networks, and dormitories for workers, and way less red tapes. China built to build. The US plays catch up while corporations chase stock price. Trump thought he can bully China into submission with tariffs. I think that's cute. The people in charge here in China right now, most are born in or before 80s. Most of us grew up with nothing. We were poor. I remember in the 80s, no toilet at home. I don't have a toilet in my family. We had to walk to a public washroom in the middle of the night. We are so used to struggle, we don't fall under pressure. We are thriving in it. This trade war is not gonna hurt China the way you think. It's gonna hurt US small businesses. And when they go down, big corporation going to buy them up. In the end of the day, you will be working for Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk while still blaming China. Go ahead, tell me wrong.
AGA believes that we want to make our money either by working in the mill or in low...
Let me tell you about manufacturing in the United States. I just got fired from a place that makes car parts for BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Tesla. BMW is putting in like 15 new robots over there. It's going to take them 2 years to set that stuff up with the computers and the engineers and the robots and getting everything. 2 years before they can actually start running it full time. And that's with robots in the building. Where's the infrastructure for manufacturing here in this country? Go to Detroit and see what happens when you leave those buildings alone. It's crumbled. We don't have infrastructure for it. Y'all who believed this were sold a pipe dream. It's never happening. 2 years before they can start running shit over there.
Do you know why we'll never bring a manufacturer back to America? Manufacturing is gone. It's automated. You think people in China are making things by hand? No, it's by robots now. This is why union is so important. That's why the Communist Party of China, or CPP, whatever you want to call it, they're protecting the people because everything's getting automated in China. Like, there is no manufacturing jobs. It's like saying we're gonna bring farmers back. No, farmers are gone. Like, we're being replaced by robots. It's been going on for decades. However, if we educate and invest in our people, maybe we'll be creating these robots as opposed to being replaced by them. Huh? Maybe, huh?
They rob you blind and you thank them for it. That's a tragedy. That's a scam. That's why I'm saying this right now. Americans, you don't need a tariff. You need a revolution. For decades, your government and oligarchs ship your job to China. Not for diplomacy, not for peace, but to exploit cheap laborers. And in the process, they hollowed out your middle class, crushed your working class, and told you to be proud while they sold your future for profit. And yes, China made money, but we used it to build roads, lift millions out of poverty, fund healthcare, raise living standard. We reinvested in our people. My family also benefited from it. What did your oligarchs do? They bought yachts, private jets, mansions with golf course driveways. They manipulate the market, dodged tax, and poured billions into endless wars. And you get stagnated wages, crippling healthcare cost, cheap dopamine, debt, and flag wave probably made in China while they pick your pocket. For 40 years, both China and the United States benefit from the trade, the manufacturing, but only one of us use that wealth to build. This isn't China's fault. This is yours. You let this happen. You let the oligarchs feed you lies. Well, they made you fat, poor, and addicted. Now they blame China for mess they made. I don't think so. I don't think you need another tariff. You need to wake up. You need to take your country back. I think you need a revolution.
The other thing I would say is that the United States is going to be in a very difficult position. It is going to discover that in the end, the only way they are going to ever get manufacturing back, to have anything like a diversified, balanced, or whatever you want to call it, economy, is if they make the wage level in the United States competitive with that where you are. And that means that they're going to have to come down on the American working class even more than they already have. And probably the way they're going to do that is by basically freezing wages as much as they can and increasing prices, having an inflation here to accomplish this job for them. And that is going to provoke, and that I can assure you, serious trouble in the social trouble in the United States. You're seeing all the signs of it, whether it's in a renewed militancy of our labor movement, which is renewed in a way it hasn't been for half a century, and in the young people of the country who are facing situations no one prepared this generation for. There aren't jobs. There is no career advancement. Just to give you an example, most of my students used to become professors. Now, most of my students can't get jobs as professors and are doing something else. And the assault on the universities is part of that larger project of redesigning the United States so it can compete with the permanent objective, no burden on corporations and the rich. Or if any burden is on them, it is going to be much greater on the rest of the population. Those are the imperatives that govern the policy around here. And other than that, they don't have anything. I mean, think what it means to grab the Panama Canal or to grab Greenland. Those are acts of desperation. You're taking land there are no people, taking land where you don't even know what's there, taking control of a canal that you had perfect free access to anyway. Look at this. This is almost like a caricature of colonialism, which I suspect is its desperate last breaths. And other than that, there is no program here. None. They're still stuck in the old laissez-faire notion, the Anglo-American notion that whatever is private is somehow better than whatever is run by the state. And so they still have to do at least verbal, but also real policy accommodation of that idea. So that limits them in terms of what they can have the state do. They even now face trouble because the level, let's remember, in our country, the Republican Party for a century has had one basic appeal to the mass of people, and that is low taxes. We won't tax you, we'll cut taxes, we'll remove taxes, we're against taxes. Yes, there are other issues they use, but that's their defining issue. Their leader now is imposing taxes and involving the government in intervention in the economy that makes a joke out of libertarian ideology. It's easy in this country to point to a big, loud libertarian who's actively intervening on every possible level in the economy to make it work. The transition to economic nationalism is real here, but the mentality of the people doing it hasn't adjusted yet.
300 foreign students have been expelled from the United States, have had their visas canceled or withdrawn. People in the middle of their PhD studying such revolutionary topics as, oceanography and so forth. But it turns out that they wrote an article about genocide in Gaza or something like that. Jesus, that's interesting. It's interesting that people who come here and participate in nonviolent, perfectly legal political expression, which is not an excluded activity by anybody, and that nothing is happening. Nothing is happening. Very few people saying much about it. The Democratic Party is DOA. It's not even there. Mr. Biden seems to have vanished into thin air. Kamala Harris with him. You're heading into the greatest crisis the Democratic Party has had in a long time.
Some kind of huge mobilizations under Bernie Sanders and AOC. What do you think are the hopes for the regeneration of the American working class after its almost decisive, which apparently seems like decisive defeats in 2020. You, of course, spoke rightly about the working class mobilizations, the huge labor movements that we've been seeing for years now in the United States. But electorally, there has been a massive backsliding. What are your thoughts about how does the American left and American people at large go about rejuvenating their politics?
Well, I believe that we are at a absolutely crucial period. There's no guarantee that it will go in the way I'm about to describe, but there is a possibility, and that's a more hopeful situation than I have seen in my many years living here in the United States. And here's how it looks. On the one hand, there is an attack on the standard of living of the working class. That is part of why they voted that portion that did for Mr. Trump. He is only president by having been, in a demagogic way, able to realize the political potential of an angry, betrayed working class. That has to be understood. And that working class can be won for an alternative vision. That's what you get in the support for Bernie Sanders, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and so on. The yearning for something else. But the two big deficits that hold us back in the United States are, number one, organization. The destruction of the left organizations, socialist parties, communist party, and labor unions that came out after World War II has proven devastating, long-lasting, and deep. And it makes for an aversion to organization that is very serious in our society. The left is strong, but the organization of the left is virtually non-existent. That's how bad it is. And the second thing they need is a clear vision of what's possible. So I'd like to end by taking off from what Professor Patnaik said. The idea of domestic demand-led growth based on a rising standard of living for the mass of the people is a winning strategic objective. But it must, and here we may disagree, who knows, but it must be accompanied by an equal transformation of the supply side, of the way in which work is organized. And I don't think you can get a sustained political support for only the demand socialization. You need also the parallel equivalent supply socialization. And I believe the two together can be the strategic focus that a renewed left could rely on. And by that I mean taking the radical step of saying that the capitalist organization of the workplace should be changed. We should democratize the workplace. We should change every factory, every office, every store into a democratically run collective of all the people who work there, who decide collectively what to produce, how to produce, what technology to use, where to produce, and how to divide the net revenue that the enterprise achieves. This would be the transformation of work, coupled together with the transformation of demand based on a rising standard of living. These would be the objectives, and they would be juxtaposed to capitalism, whose objective is profit maximization, and we expose that profit is what the tiny minority at the top get. So to make the rule profit maximization is the enemy, not the achievement of efficiency in economics. I think that's a winning proposition. My only hope is that Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez go in that direction.
The dollar is tanking. We are, as I'm talking to you right now, we are 3 percentage points away from a historic low for the dollar. You know what that means, ladies and gentlemen? The world is dumping the dollar. It is not long for this earth as the world reserve currency. Well, the whole thing propping up our economy was the low cost of consumer goods and the fact that the dollar is the world reserve currency. As soon as those things go away, no more cheap consumer goods, and the dollar is no longer the world reserve currency, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? I'll tell you what, the house of cards is going to fall. The giant bubble in the economy is going to burst. We're going to have stagflation. We're going to have massive unemployment at the same time prices are going up. We're going to have pain the likes of which we haven't seen since the Great Depression. That's what's going to happen. And there's been 5-alarm fire blaring since fucking liquidation day, as I call it. Right? And what? We're still right where we were at the beginning, except in a worse scenario, because now the world knows we can't fucking trust these people. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Chinese century. The Chinese century is here. The question is, how much can we attempt to mitigate the pain that's going to be felt in America? Because there's going to be a tremendous amount of pain felt in this country. So, look, my guess is Trump is looking to get literally a piece of the action, like a mob boss. Hey, yeah, I'll lower your tariff rate, but you got to give me a percentage point. Or I'll lower your tariff rate, but you got to give me X amount of millions of dollars, right? Just straight up, no holds barred, most obvious corruption of all time. That's one potentiality. The other thing is he just truly is ideologically married to this idea of tariffs, and the end goal would be, let's do tariffs, which is a tax on the working class effectively, while at the same time massively cutting taxes for multimillionaires and billionaires and corporations. Right? And so it's a way to do the old reversal, right? Let's not have a progressive tax system. Let's have a regressive tax system. Let's make the bottom 95% pay everything, and let's let the wealthiest get away scot-free. Because Trump always talked about 1890s were the best time in America. We're richer than we've ever been. What was the 1890s? It was the Gilded Age. 10 people had everything. Everybody else was fighting for the crumbs. We had child labor. People lived in tenement homes. 10 people living in a small, tiny one-room apartment. Right? This is what he wants. This is what he wants. It's probably a mix of all of these things is what's going on. But this is, even with that, there's a grand evil plan, but they're also massive fucking idiots, and they don't know how to land the plane, dog. Like, if they wanted to do this nefarious evil master plan, okay, you could try to pull it off, but worst you'd ever want to deal with is a recession, not a depression, right? Well, we're heading for a fucking depression.
The United States is going to have to deal with the consequences of its own policy. If not in the form of migration, then in the form of an exploded Central America. And this is all occluded by dealing with immigrants as if they were a mystery, have nothing to do with the United States, except to burden us with their presence. As I said before, this is a complete nonsense based on the history of this country, which is a history of becoming a powerhouse in the world precisely because you attracted and successfully integrated immigrants.
Are growing their wealth very rapidly, and it's acting like a black hole in society. It's sucking the wealth away from the middle class, from the working class, from the government. Rishi Sunak suddenly magically appeared in the Times richest people, top 100 richest people in the country. A wealth of £700 million. I think what people often don't realise is the passive income that comes with that. What's his passive income? The income he gets just from his wealth, not from his work. 5%, £35 million a year. Let's be conservative, £26 million a year, £500,000 a week. So imagine you're Rishi Sunak now, and you're making £500,000 passive income a week. Problem is, once you have this group of society with very large passive income, unless you have a rapidly growing economy, they basically have nothing they can do with that income other than buy up the rest of the assets, outgrow the economy, and they squeeze everyone else out. And what ordinary people see is house prices going up, stock prices going up, my kids can't afford a house. And what that is the rich squeezing.
Once you get above a certain level of wealth, you get no incremental happiness. So why on earth would you not go back to a tax policy of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where, say, above, pick a big number, 10 million, you actually pay more than 10%, maybe more than 20%, maybe more than 50%, because the difference between 30,000 a year for a household and 50,000 is enormous to the well-being of that household. Low-income kids in low-income households have higher resting blood pressure, but the difference between making 10 million a year and 15 million a year offers you no happiness. But these individuals have weaponized government, and we risk revolution, whether it's CEOs being murdered in the street whether it's a Me Too movement that had righteous components of it or Black Lives Matter, what are these movements? They are targeting the wealthy. We are in the midst of a series of small revolutions to correct income inequality. And the reason we put an insurrectionist and a rapist in office is because for the first time in our nation's history, a 30-year-old man or woman isn't doing as well as his or her parents were at 30. Why? Because the majority of households are having the oxygen sucked out of the room such that a small number of individuals and a small number of companies can be worth more than nation states. Income inequality is out of control. Our tax policy has gone full oligarch.